turning to Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1. That'll be where we are here in just a moment. Galatians chapter 1. We'll be continuing our study. We began Wednesday in the book of Galatians. Just a reminder, I believe, I did not check. I can't tell from here. I think there may still be some books on the back. If there's not, let me know. I've got the original copy in the office, so I can print copy more of those off if you need a copy of the workbook on Galatians. But they're on the back table under the picture board, or at least that's where they were. So if there's still some there, if you need to pick one up, you can pick one up there. If there's not, let me know, and I can get some more, try to get more copied off this afternoon. So you can have those by Wednesday. If you would, before we get into Galatians 1, let's go through our outlines of the book. The outline we're following, but we're going to look at the other two that we mentioned on Wednesday as well, and then we'll get back into chapter 1. We've covered the first few verses. We'll review that, and then we'll get into the rest of chapter 1. The book of Galatians is a defense of Paul's apostleship and about justification by faith through grace. So Paul, like he was at the end of 2 Corinthians, is having to defend his apostleship. The big reason Paul's having to defend his apostleship in the first two chapters is because he's going to have to come into the defense of the gospel in the next two chapters, chapters 3 and 4. And what's happening is there are those who are going after Paul's apostleship in order to go after his teaching. That is, if you can disprove Paul's apostleship, Paul's not really an apostle, you thus, by extension, disprove his teaching. The problem at Galatia is there are Judaizing teachers. There are those who are here coming to Galatia and trying to teach that they need to be circumcised. Gentiles need to be circumcised to be saved. That's what's taking place as a large part in Galatians. That's why Galatians 2, which we'll get to, Lord willing, on Wednesday, serves a twofold purpose in Paul's relation of the story. The first of those two stories, in talking about going to Jerusalem, and in the rebuke, they prove him to be an apostle by the apostles extending the right hand of fellowship to him, and by him rebuking an apostle. He's not inferior to the other apostles. But they also further prove the arguments concerning circumcision, because he begins by talking about the discussion at Jerusalem over circumcision, and then he rebukes Peter for his hypocrisy concerning those who were uncircumcised. That's the main problem at Galatians. They're attacking the gospel and trying to go back to the old law and saying you need to be circumcised to be saved. The outlines that we're following in the book, we'll follow mine that we'll get to in a minute, but I mentioned these the other day, and I want to bring them up again. William Hendrickson's outline, chapters 1 and 2, the gospel's origination, chapters 3 and 4, the gospel's vindication, and 5 and 6, the gospel's application. We showed Irving Jensen's, the source of the gospel 1 through 2:21, the defense of the gospel 3:1 through 5:1, and then 5 verse 2 through the end of the book is the application of the gospel. We're following my outline here. But again, as I mentioned, we want to find whatever's easiest for us to remember. So if one of the easier ones for you to remember the breakdown of Galatians is Hendrickson's or Jensen, then remember that. I'll show those, try to remember to show those each time we go through the book, just like we'll show the outline we are following. But if one of those is easier for you to remember the content of Galatians, remember those. Whatever helps us to remember it the easiest. But the outline we're following, 1 and 2 is the apostleship defended, 3 and 4 the gospel defended, and 5 and 6 is application defined. We started chapter 1 on Wednesday evening. Chapter 1 is Paul is an apostle of God, not man. We covered through verse 9. We'll go through that again here briefly and then try to finish up the chapter this morning. But Paul begins in 1 through 5 with the claim of apostleship. In verse 1 he says, Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through men, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. So again, the accusations made about Paul is Paul's not really an apostle. or at least not an apostle of God, maybe an apostle of man. That seems to be the argument. And so Paul begins here by saying, I'm not an apostle sent from men, as the Legacy Standard would say, or through man. That is, the source of his apostleship does not originate from man, with a body of men, but is divine in its origin. That's the idea of from man, nor is it through man. There's no agency with men where he's now an apostle, and he's really an apostle of God, but he went through some human agency, which seems to be one of the accusations. So here are the two. Let's back up and distinguish the two real quick. The source of apostleship, that is, you were made an apostle by men. And so it's man's teaching. The other side is that he may be an apostle of God, but not at least on the same sense as Peter and James and them, maybe through men. We'll get to this later on in the chapter, but it seems the argument some make is, well, you may be teaching what the others are teaching, but you got your teaching from them. Like there was some apostle school that he went to, and Peter and them were teaching a school on here how to be an apostle. And they told him what to do. He answers that argument in chapter 1. The second one about being inferior, he continues into chapter 2, which really connects those two. If it's through men, then he would be inferior to Peter and all the others if they taught him how to be an apostle. So those are the two. One, it does not come from man. They're not the origination of man, nor is it through men. It's not that men taught me so that I could be an apostle, what God said, but it is through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. The source and the agency was both Christ and God. And so he's an apostle of God. 2 and 3, he gives his greetings from all the brethren who are with him to the churches of Galatia. He says, grace to you and peace from God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. And then 4 and 5, he talks about salvation being through Christ, who gave himself, verse 4, for our sins, that he might deliver us from this present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. And so salvation is through Christ. This is important because, remember, we're dealing with these issues here that are coming up at Galatia. And the reason 1 and 2 he defends his apostleship is because of 3 and 4, which is the attack on the teaching. And some of them are saying, the Judaizers are saying, you've got to go back to the old law and be circumcised to be saved. Paul says, no, salvation's not going to be in that law. He's going to talk about that more in 3 and 4. But it's through Christ, and he begins with that. So really, in the first 5 verses, Paul's dealt with the 2 main issues of the book to some extent. Obviously, he's going to deal with it more and answer those arguments. But the 2 main issues, is Paul an apostle? And that we have to go back to the old law and say, those are the 2 main issues. Paul begins by saying, I'm an apostle, and salvation is in Christ. And so he answers both of those quickly. 6 through 9, then, is the message of the apostle rejected. The first of those in 6 and 7 is you're turning away, being turned away by false teachers. He says, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. We talked about this on Wednesday evening. The King James, I believe, uses the same term in both of those. I think it's just something like to another gospel, which is not another. And it doesn't distinguish in the English the fact that there are 2 separate words that appear here in verse 6. In verse 6, it is the word heteron, which is another of a different kind. And in verse 7, it is the word allo, which is another of the same kind. And so here's the point he's making. I marvel that you're so quickly turning from Christ to a gospel from a different place. That's what's happening. They're not turning to other people who are teaching the truth. If Paul is teaching the truth, and then these Judaizers are coming in and teaching something opposite, they both cannot be right. Like Paul's saying you don't have to be circumcised to be saved. The Judaizers are saying you have to be circumcised to be saved. They can't both be right because those are 2 contrary doctrines. And so what he's saying is you're believing something from a different source. There's not another from the same source. That is, there's not another gospel from God. This is originating from somewhere else. This is what's originating from man. Not Paul's apostleship, not Paul's teaching, but these Judaizers, they're originating from somewhere else, not from God. Yes.
Think about Ephesians 4, it kind of reiterates this. He said, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. For the one faith, there will be one system of faith. And Jude, verse 3 says, earnestly contend for the faith. So, in a way, that these aspects I mentioned, they kind of make that one point. Another gospel would be like another faith instead of the faith. Another gospel would be not the one faith, there would be multiple faiths. So this is kind of a theme throughout the Paul's letters.
Absolutely, you're right. And that's the problem that they're having here in Galatia, is they're listening to this other teaching, and now they're sort of caught between, all right, is Paul right or is these others right? And these others are trying to disprove Paul so they can try to prove themselves, right? Because they're saying we're teaching something different. They know they both can't be right? You can't be uncircumcised and be saved, and then have to be circumcised and be saved. And so that's why they're trying to disprove Paul. And Paul's saying there's only one source of teaching. There's no other gospel from God. And so they both can't be right. So I think that's something most modern translations capture that well. The New King James says different in another. I think the ESV says different in another. The Legacy Standard or the New American Standard, I think, say different in another. But some of the King James, I think, uses the same word there, which can cause some confusion because it seems like a contradiction. But when you look at the more modern translations, they use two different words. That's because Paul uses two different words, and he's saying, you're turning the gospel from somewhere else. There is no other gospel from God. That's why there's not another. In fact, what he says is what they're doing is they trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ by taking and twisting and by teaching something contrary to what Paul has taught, what the other apostles have taught. That's perverting the gospel when they take and they twist that message.
Paul also says, John wrote, whoever transgresses and abides not in the doctrine of Christ doesn't have God. Even John brought that point out. The teachings, the doctrine, sometimes people try to make these distinctions. I guess it's kind of the way they justify like universal or diversity. Unity and diversity and all these things. But, all these things go back to the point that it has to be the teaching of Christ. It's not the one that's mentioned.
You're right. In fact, this is when he goes on to point here in 8 and 9 where he says, but even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let it be accursed. As we have said before, so now I'll say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you've received, let it be accursed. So what he says here in 8 and 9 is, if we came to you and then preached something contrary to what we already preached to you, let us be accursed. And that is, take a step back and let's go to think about 2 Corinthians for a moment. And remember what Paul said. When Paul talked about the claim of his apostleship in 2 Corinthians, he said that the signs of a true apostle were done. So as Paul's going through these regions and teaching, there were signs that would accompany him that was saying Paul's teaching the truth. Well, now, if Paul teaches one message and hear all the miracles and everything performed, and then Paul comes back a few years later and teaches a different message, well, this first one has to be true because of what? All of the evidence that came with it, right? The signs and everything. That's what those were for, was to prove they were teaching the truth. If he comes over here and is teaching something different, let him be accursed. That's contrary to what was taught and was proven to be true. Even if an angel from heaven teaches something contrary, let him be accursed. If an angel appeared and started teaching something and it doesn't line up with what the scriptures say, and they could prove to us, listen, I'm an angel, but they're telling something other than what is recorded in the gospel message, it says, let them be accursed, right? That's contrary to the gospel. This is the one truth. Anything other than that is false, right? If there's one absolute truth, here's the truth. Here, that one faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. If there's only one, anything other than that is not true. Now, we mentioned this before. I think it's important at times that we talk about how to answer some of these different questions that are raised. Right? Somebody comes and says, that we should have instruments, music, and worship. We need to know how to be able to answer that. Somebody says, what about a fellowship hall, so on and so forth? We need to know how to answer those, each of those specifically. But when we know the truth, right, here's the truth, which is we need to sing. Here's the truth about eating we're talking about eating at home, so on and so forth. When we know this to be the truth, we can then answer these arguments over here, because these are opposite of the truth. And so now we know how to answer that. And that's the point. If they teach anything other than what we've already taught, it can't be true, because you've already heard that one truth. Yes?
We need to sanctify them to the truth. Thy word is truth. John 17:17. You think about it, this had to be difficult, because they didn't have the Bible in front of them. Book, chapter, and verse, which we do. So if Paul comes one day and says something, and then he comes the next day and says something different, he just got done telling them, don't listen to what I'm saying the next day. Listen to what I said the first day. How are they supposed to know? It just makes me think of the prophet. God told him to go, and don't come back, and the other prophet said, no, you come stay in my house, I'm a prophet too. It's like difficult to understand. And that's with your lesson this morning about the young people. There's so many different ways, that, according to them, all the different religions in the world, that can be pleasing to God. The wagon wheel thing, everything points to the middle, and we can do it, and you can do it, everybody can do it. That's wrong, and it's so deceiving. There's so many different ways to do it, and we need to make sure we're using book, chapter, and verse.
You're right, and that's their problem here, is that when these Judaizers come just trying to disclaim Paul had that evidence with him of all those miracles to prove the truth, and yet they're still trying to go the opposite of that. And that's why Paul says, I marvel, I'm amazed you're turning so quickly. It's like you hear the truth, and then as soon as the truth is preached to you, somebody else comes along without all that other evidence. Again, keep in mind, Paul working these miracles and everything. These others come along without all that evidence, and as soon as it comes along, you just quickly turn and go, you know what, we're going to go listen to this over here. Paul's having to say, that's a problem, because you're rejecting the truth. You're rejecting the message that had that evidence with it, and it cannot both be true. Now, the third section, after Paul deals with the message of apostle rejected, is the evidence of apostleship, and that spans 10 through 24. So, what Paul does here is he's giving evidence. He's an apostle. More particularly, he's an apostle of God, and through God, not through man. So that's really done with the second half of what he said in verse 1. He begins in 10 through 12 by making the claim of an apostle, to be an apostle of God again. He made the claim once before, verse 1, but he makes the claim again here before he gives a number of evidences of that. Not all the evidence. He'll give more evidence of that in chapter 2, but he starts the evidence here in chapter 1. The claim, he's an apostle of God. He says first and foremost, verse 10, I'm not seeking the approval of man. For do I now persuade men or God, or do I seek to please men? For if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. And so Paul's point is, I'm not trying to please men. Right there, here are these Judaizers coming in. Are they going to be pleased with Paul? No. Are there going to be others that are going to be happy with Paul when they hear the message he has to preach? No. Paul doesn't care about that. Why? He's not seeking man's approval. He wants the approval of God. In fact, remember, he talked about that in 2 Corinthians, when we're studying 2 Corinthians, about the ones that are approved of God. For not he who commends himself, chapter 10 and verse 18 of 2 Corinthians, for not he who commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends. So it's not the man that commends himself, it's not the man commended by other men. It's the one commended by God that is approved. And so what Paul's saying here is, I'm not seeking man's approval. I'm seeking the approval of God. So now he comes in the next few verses and says, and that message I received wasn't from men. Right? It wasn't because he wanted to please men that he's out preaching the gospel. It's because he received the gospel from God. Verse 11 and 12. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man, for I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, it's not that Paul's teaching man's message, right? It's not that Paul's saying, well, here's the message of men, nor is it that Paul's teaching this message and saying, it's not the message of men, it's the message of God, but I was taught it by men. And again, it's a slight distinction between the two. One saying the source is man, the other saying it was men that taught him the truth. And so, like he went and looked, that he went and sat at Peter's feet and James' feet and John's and so on and so forth. And they told him, here's the teaching, and that he taught it. That's the more specific one he's dealing with here. He's not taught it by men. He says, instead, it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. Christ is the source of that message that he's preaching, verse 12. Well, how does Paul prove that? How does Paul prove, well, the message is from God? Well, now, if we back up for just a second, as we mentioned earlier, the miracles and things he would have worked on his missionary journeys or preaching journeys would be evidence of that. But Paul gives more evidence of that here in the rest of the chapter. He begins by pointing out about his former life and then his conversion. Look at verse 13 through 17. For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my father. Now let's stop there for a second. What Paul has just said is, you know how I was before I obeyed the gospel. What was Paul like? Well, he was a persecutor of the church. Go back to Acts chapter 7 and in verse 59, Stephen's put to death. Whose feet are the coats at? It's Saul, who we better know as Paul. Acts chapter 8, who consented to the death of Stephen? Saul or Paul. Who is it that's going and ravaging the church in Acts chapter 8? Saul. Who is it in Acts chapter 9 receiving letters to go to Damascus and put disciples in prison? It's Saul, right? Or who we better know as Paul. He's the one doing all that. He's trying to destroy it. And in fact, he was advancing in Judaism far beyond his contemporaries. I made this point before. If Paul did not already, when he obeyed the gospel, if he did not already have a seat on the Sanhedrin Council, he was probably well on his way. He was a respected Pharisee. He was a persecutor of the church. Here's a man who was just excelling in Judaism. He was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel, who was a well-respected teacher of the Jews. I mean, here he's just excelling in Judaism. He was exceedingly zealous for all of this. Right? Verse 15 now. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Now, he says, I was excelling in Judaism. But then it pleased God, when it pleased God who had separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace. So here's a distinction. How is it that he's an apostle? It's because he was separated by God. Right? It's not that Paul was chosen by Peter or James or John or any of the other apostles. In fact, if the apostles were going to choose a man to sort of train to be an apostle, if you will, which seems to be some of the accusation, Paul probably wouldn't have been first on the list, second on the list, or in the top 500 probably of the list in that area. I mean, here's a persecutor of the church. He probably wouldn't have been the one at the top of the list. Right? And here he is as an apostle. And he's saying, I was separated so that I could teach to the Gentiles, and I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. So let's just think through real quick the book of Acts. We're not going to go turn there for all of it this morning. But when you go to Acts chapter 9, Paul's on the road to Damascus. He sees the Lord on the road to Damascus. He's then taught the gospel by Ananias. He's baptized. What he's taught is what he has to do to be saved, by the way. All of this other stuff that we read further on, and that's his point, was not given to him by flesh and blood. First of all, Ananias was not one of the apostles. But secondly, what Ananias did is tell him what he had to do to be saved. All the rest of this about the Gentiles being saved and not being circumcised, all of these things that he's teaching, the majority of that is something that he was not taught by man. He received that from God. That's the point he made back in verse 12. He didn't go to Jerusalem to confer with flesh and blood, nor did they come to him. The apostles are still back in Jerusalem when Paul's converted. What Paul does then is he's in Damascus, he goes to Arabia. If you look at a map, that's from Damascus, that's the opposite direction of Jerusalem. Why did he go to Arabia? We don't know. There's some speculation. We can speculate all we want. We don't know. Two main things speculated. One is that he went to sort of reflect after obeying the gospel on everything. The second is that perhaps while in Arabia, this is where he received some of those revelations, like he talked about in 2 Corinthians 12 from God before he went back and taught the gospel. I don't know. Perhaps a combination of the two. But whatever it was, he went to Arabia, and then he returns to Damascus. Acts chapter 9, Paul's teaching there in Damascus. Yes.
Think about Paul. He didn't lack anything that the original 12 were given. And, when Jesus told him, when he sent out 2 and 2, he said, when they reject the word, he said, when you shake the dust off his testimony, then you go over into the book of Acts, after Paul started preaching the word, the Jewish people rejected it. Okay, so what did he do? He shook the dust off as a testimony. Then he went on to the Gentiles. I mean, that's just one specific thing that we know that Jesus would have taught the original 12. Saul, of course, Paul wouldn't have been there for that. But we can see there that he did not lack anything that he needed in order to function as one of those apostles.
You're right. In fact, he gives further evidence that when he gets into chapter 2, which is what chapter 2 is about. Chapter 1, I'm not an apostle of men. Chapter 2, I'm not inferior to the original 12. And that's where he gives the evidence of they extended the right hand of fellowship, and then he rebukes one of the original 12 in Peter. Yeah.
I think about, back up a little bit here, we talked about when he seek to please man. When you think if he was wanting to do that, he would just stay in Judaism, because he had all that scars on his body and stuff. If that's what his intent was, to please man, why would he ever convert to Christianity? Because basically, he was pleasing the Jewish people then, but he agreed to not please man if preaching the gospel was going to cause him to be beaten. We know. So he made a tough decision there, and it obviously wasn't based on the here and now. He wanted eternal life, so he decided not to please man, but rather to please Christ.
Absolutely, you're right. And that's part of his point he makes back there is, I wouldn't be a servant of Christ if I was trying to please men. Verse 18 through 20 then, he points out about what he's done before, and that should be not verse 10, but verse 13 through 17. He then points out when he first went to Jerusalem, he'd already been preaching the gospel for 3 years. Look at verse 18 through 20. Then, after 3 years, I went up to see Peter and remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now, concerning the things which I write to you, indeed, before God, I do not lie. Real quick, a couple of things to point here. It's 3 years after he started preaching. That's when he goes to Jerusalem. So he's been teaching the gospel for 3 years before he ever meets any of the apostles. When he goes to this visit on Jerusalem that he talks about, he's there for how long? 15 days. And he sees Peter. By the way, that word see means to go, to investigate, to examine, to find out. The idea of that word rendered see is he went to learn more about Peter, not more about what message they should be teaching. He already knew what the gospel said. He'd been preaching it. And then he sees none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. He's not saying James is an apostle. And that's one of the ways rendered, one of the apostles except James. Some that understand the original language commented that really what he's saying is, I saw none of the other apostles. The only other person I saw was James, the Lord's brother. So he sees Peter, he sees James, the Lord's brother. He didn't see John and Andrew and so on and so forth. He only saw them. And then real quick, 21 and 20 through 23, after he spent 15 days there, he goes to Syria and Cilicia, and he was unknown to the faces of the churches of Judea. If Peter and the others had taught him, had brought him to Jerusalem to teach him, those in Judea would have known him by face, right? They would have seen him. What he's saying is they didn't know him by face. They just knew that he who formerly persecuted the faith now teaches that which he once sought to destroy. And so they didn't know him face to face. They knew him through reputation only, that he had been converted and obeyed the truth. Lord willing, we will pick up at chapter 2 and study chapter 2 of Galatians on Wednesday evening.